Oh, okay. Everybody can hear me. Awesome. Is anybody in here using Webpack at this moment? I mean, not at this moment, but like at work. Nobody? Okay, you guys, this is a perfect audience for my talk then. Okay, so what is Webpack? Webpack is a module bundler. So if you're wondering, what's a module? A module is a piece of code. It could be seriously as small as one single function, but somebody else wrote it and you pull it into your application to use within your application. So Bootstrap is a really great example of a module. It is not one function, it's actually a massive thing, but you're pulling in someone else's code and you're using it within your application. And in Bootstrap's case, that's for styling. So if you've noticed, like, a lot of websites across the internet have this like grid system where it's like 3 columns and they've got like, they all look pretty similar stylistically. They're probably using Bootstrap, which is a really popular module. And Webpack is something you can use to bundle modules together. So I already mentioned Bootstrap. Basically, it makes this work in the browser. So we have Bootstrap, we've declared it as a variable, and then we're requiring a module. So interestingly enough, even though this is an incredibly common paradigm across all of web development, all front-end web development anyway, require is not supported in any browser. So I'm getting some funny looks. I agree, it is an interesting thing, but require is not supported in Chrome, Safari, Edge, Firefox. It's not supported. And so what Webpack does for you is it takes these modules that you're requiring for use in your application, and it essentially is making require work in the browser. And here in just a little bit, I'm going to explain to you what it's actually doing. So what Webpack is doing is it's bundling. We've already talked about that. It's making those requires work within your application. And it's also minifying your code. So if you've ever looked at JavaScript, it can be quite large. Minifying your code, it can include like removing white space and other minification things. If you've ever been in a production website and you've popped open the console and you've seen this like gibberish looking code, that's minified code. And the reason you want to minify your code is because it's going to give you smaller JavaScript bundles, which is in turn going to make your website faster. So when your website is loading in, it goes back to the server that's serving up the code, and like anything large, like it's going to take just that much longer to get from the server to your user. So smaller bundles are a good thing. Also, if I talk way too fast, just tell me to like cool it. So the reason I chose to talk about Webpack is because it really is the standard across the web right now. Everything is using Webpack to bundle JavaScript and front-end files. Just a couple examples, if you've heard of Angular, AngularCLI uses Webpack to bundle your Angular application. If you've heard of Vue, which we're doing a Vue talk in a couple of months, so I'm excited. No, we did one. We did one in January. Check it out. It was from Sabrina, and she was awesome. VueCLI also uses Webpack to bundle your application. React is something we're going to talk about later this year. It also uses Webpack. You might see a theme here. Basically, any scaffold that you find, any like helper that gives you like a skeleton app to start working with, they're all using. Individually, but just so you know what the 4 parts are, it's entry, your output, loaders, and plugins. So we'll start with the entry. It's in the name a little bit. It's the entry point for our application. So whenever somebody loads in the root of your application, the file that's linked in the root of your application, typically your index.js file, that's the entry point. And then from here, Webpack determines which modules should be included. So if you are requiring something in your index, Webpack's going to kind of like go into that file, and then any requires within that file, and then all the way down. It's going to just keep on going like file to file to file to figure out which modules need to be included. And it's great because you don't have to do that. Webpack does it for you. And I kind of was explaining like it goes from file to find the required modules, and that's based on what our app is using. So if you have installed a module that you decided not to use, that doesn't end up in your app that goes to production, because it's only bundling what your app is actually using. And I mentioned before, entry is almost always going to be your index.js file. Next is output. This is the location where our built files are put. Usually it's going to be like a build folder or a dist folder or something like that. And it has to be an absolute path. I'm going to give you an example of how you do that. A relative path in JavaScript is where you'll see two quotes and it'll be like // and then the path. An absolute path is like the true absolute path. So it would be like, for these slides, for example, it would be like C drive / whatever. It's the complete path. And that's, you'll see in the example. So if this is all you get today, this is what you need to be able to start using Webpack. This is the bare minimum that you could possibly need. So we're defining our entry, which you'll notice is a relative path. That might be a little confusing, but the entry can be a relative path. Next, output is an object. We're telling it the path. So path.resolve is something that you get out of the box from Node. You don't have to install anything. We're requiring it, and we're passing in the dir name. So dir name in this instance is the directory that you're currently in. So your server is looking at this file. It says, what directory am I currently in? And then it's going to concatenate. So that means like add to the end. Dist, or that could be build. The second parameter can be whatever you want to call your build folder. It could be My Little Pony or whatever. It could be anything. And then in this instance, everything is getting bundled into a single file. And so you give that file a name right here as a part of the file name. Everybody with me so far? Okay, super. If you do have any questions, just shout. It's totally fine. So moving on to loaders. Loaders is the third part of a Webpack config. And they allow you to require non-JavaScript or JSON files. That's important because Webpack on its own doesn't really support non-JavaScript or JSON files. So loaders kind of bridge the gap. A really good example, I think, of what you would use a loader for, because when I was kind of starting to work with this, I was like, I understand the need to build a bundle for production, but I don't really understand like what do I need loaders for? Like I don't really get it. And so this I think is a really good example. CSS modules. So if you want your CSS to end up in the same dist directory as your JavaScript bundle, you could do it with a CSS loader. Same with HTML modules. So if you've ever had a template that you used for a module in your, a modal in your application, and you used like a string template, you could actually pull that string template into a file and bundle it in using the HTML loader that I'm going to show you. So if we pretend up here that the entry and output were still there, this is what a loader might look like. This in particular is the CSS loader. So we have this test. That property accepts a regex. Regex is a regular expression. It searches for that file extension. So anything that ends in .css, it's going to take this loader and apply it. And essentially what it's doing is it's converting it to a string so that Webpack can work with it, and then doing some other transforms on it, and it ends up in a file at the very end. And one quick note, the use, so these are functions essentially that somebody else wrote. And while it's normal for us to read from left to right, or I guess you guys left to right, sorry. I always like to joke about anyway, it was a bad joke. CSS loader is actually going to get run first. So if you were going to think about that, you would think about you're calling style loader, and then you're passing in CSS Loader as a parameter to Style Loader. And so if you thought about that, like the innermost function parameter gets called first, and it goes out from there. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind for Webpack. The use property is it actually goes from right to left. So HTML Loader I also mentioned. This is one that I'm using at work right now because I actually do have a modal that I have multiple modals in this application actually, that rather than like have some really like janky looking string in my JavaScript, I just pulled it out into a file. And this is how it gets loaded in. So we're looking for anything that ends with the HTML extension, and then we're defining the loader. You might notice that this one is a little different because we're passing in an object instead of a string. So the use parameter can accept a string, or it accepts an object. I'm so sorry. It accepts an array. The array can contain strings or objects. And that's because if we wanted to pass in options to our loader, because again, the loader is really just a function. So if we wanted to specify options, so one option that HTML Loader has is minimize or minify, and that's where it takes out all the white space. So if we wanted to specify that, you would pass in an options property, and you would define those as a part of that object. Does that make sense so far? Okay. If it doesn't, just shout. So I found it a little difficult to try to understand what the difference between loaders and plugins really are, because I mentioned that loaders are basically functions that get called to transform whatever file we're working with. Plugins are also just functions, but the difference is that while a loader is really focused on like a specific file or a file type, like HTML or CSS or something like that, plugins can be run on the entire bundle. And yeah, loaders are for transforming files. Plugins, they can be used for anything. And it really is just like a JavaScript function that you're calling. So this is a plugin that I'm using at work right now, and I really dig it because what this one allows you to do if you use it in this way is when you're running your build, so say you type npm run build, you can pass in a parameter that defines, is it production or is it development? And then if you had stuff in your application that, you know, in prod, I want you to use the prod database, but in development, obviously don't use production, right? Like, please don't use production. So yeah, if you have a dev QA and production database, and for different environments of your application, you need to use different URLs or anything like that, that's how I use it at work. So I specify, like, is it production? And this is a part of the Webpack config. And so what this is actually doing is it's giving my application, on the application side, a global variable called production that I can always reference and say, hey, should I use the production stuff or should I use the not production stuff? There's a lot more you can do with this as well, but that's kind of my favorite example. So, and I included a couple of resources. If you want to learn more about Webpack, I highly recommend this one. The first one's good too, but it's the Webpack docs, so you're going to find yourself there anyway. But Webpack Academy is a free video course from Sean Larkin. He's the guy who made Webpack, so he'll do a way better job of explaining it than I could. And it's a free course. I did the whole thing. It took, of the videos, it was like 20 minutes of videos. So it was awesome, and I highly recommend it. And if there aren't any questions... All right.